All right, great. So Lauren, you could advance to the next slide. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sean Burns. I'm with 3C Ren, and I'm here in the county of Santa Barbara as well. Today we have Amy Dryden with the Association for Energy Affordability, Lauren Hotell with Franklin Energy, here to cover our 2022 Energy Code overview, what's new. But before we get started with that training, I'll roll through a few housekeeping slides so we're all on the same page. Perfect. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Zoom at this point, but just to reiterate, we do ask that you are on mute throughout the duration of the training, so that lets our presenters speak without interruption. If you would like to participate verbally, we may stop and ask for questions. You can use the raise hand function. That should be on the bottom row under the participant tab. And we do encourage you to ask your questions throughout the training by using the chat box. Lauren, Amy, myself will keep an eye on that as well. And for attendance purposes, we do ask that you do have some name on your screen as well, whether that's your first name and a last initial, just to let us know who you are. And that's especially useful for some learning units if you've submitted your AIA or ICC number. And then finally, this training will be recorded so that we can share it out with you in the follow-up email, and it may be posted to 3C Ren's on-demand page as well. Awesome. All right, next slide. Okay, just a little background on who 3C Ren is. 3C Ren, the Tri-County Regional Energy Network. We are 3 counties working together to provide some energy efficiency, to actually improve the energy efficiency programming in our region by offering free services, free programming for building professionals and households. We are funded by ratepayer dollars that we all already pay into our utility bills through the public goods charge. The benefit of that is that there's no cost to those that we serve. And as a regional energy network, we're able to return some of those dollars back into our local area, which we've historically missed out on in the past. Perfect. All right. And then I believe with that, I'll hand it over to Amy and Lauren to get into the bulk of our training today. So thank you so much, Amy and Lauren, for being here with us today.
Thanks, Sean. So we can go ahead and maybe do our quick introduction. So my name is Lauren Hotell. I'm with Franklin Energy. I am also one of the Energy Code coaches. So if you use the Energy Code Coach hotline through 3C Ren, you'll most likely be talking to me at some point. And so I'll turn it over to Amy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Amy Dryden with the Association for Energy Affordability, Director of Strategic Innovations there. And thanks for joining us this morning.
Great. So let's go ahead and jump in. So today's learning objectives are pretty simple. We want to make sure that you come out of this with an understanding of what the code update process looks like, understand what changes are coming under the 2022 code cycle and how they'll affect your work. And lastly, how the changes will affect single family, multifamily, and non-residential building projects. And just some additional information. So this training is meant to be a really high level overview of what's coming next year. We do have 3 additional courses that will dive into specific building type training information. So the preview for single family projects is on February 10th. The preview for multifamily projects is on February 15th. And then the preview for non-residential projects is on March 17th. And again, those will be specific to the building information, really much deeper dive than we're focusing on today. So we'll just run through a quick agenda. We're going to run through sort of the code update process, and then we'll jump into single family, multifamily, and non-residential changes. And then we'll round out the morning with some Q&A. And as Sean said earlier, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat. We'll be monitoring it and can jump in when questions pop up. So Sean did have a nice map of the Tri-County region up earlier, but we wanted to highlight the Tri-County climate zones that we'll be focusing on, 4, 5, 6, and 9 and 16. Sorry, I left 9 off there. The information in these slides will cover all climate zones, but we just wanted to sort of remind everybody these are the 5 climate zones that we're focusing on. So if you see them in the slides, don't worry about it. We wanted to include them just so you're aware. If you're working outside the climate zones, you know stuff is still required or required prescriptively. So what do we need to know about 2022 building code? The code is updated on a 3-year cycle. So previous cycle went into effect January 1st, 2020. This cycle will go into effect January 1st, 2023. So any projects permitted on or after January 1st will fall under the 2022 code. The preliminary documents are available online on that link on your screen, and you'll get a copy of the slides afterwards. So you'll be able to access that link there. So just, I know the nomenclature is a bit confusing, goes into effect in 2023, but it's called the 2022 code. That's just the way it is. So the 4 key areas for new construction that the 2022 code is focusing on is it's encouraging electric heat pump technology for space and water heating, which consumes less energy and produces fewer emissions than gas powered units. So that's exciting for both indoor air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. It establishes electric ready requirements for single family homes. This way it can position the owners to use cleaner electric heating, cooking, and potentially electric vehicle charging options if they choose to adopt those options. Whoa, sorry about that. It expands solar system and battery storage standards to make clean energy more available on site and to complement the state's progress towards 100% clean and 100% clean electricity grid. And it also strengthens ventilation standards to improve indoor air quality. So I know that's a really important part for a lot of people in the state who have asthma or other respiratory issues that are caused by breathing in those poor indoor air quality that we all have from using our gas cooking and our gas space heating and stuff like that. So why does the CEC update the policy every 4 years? The goal of this cycle of updates is that homes and businesses will use nearly 70% of California's electricity and are responsible for 1/4 of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a really big chunk of the state's usage. So this CEC updates the policy every 3 years to reduce those energy usages and the costs to ratepayers. It also helps limit the environmental impacts of energy generation, and it helps ensure a safe and resilient and reliable supply of energy. I know we're all pretty aware of the resiliency and reliability issues that the state's been experiencing. So the goal of the code is to really help out with that. So with the new 2022 code, we do have some section reorganization. Rather than being low-rise residential and high-rise residential / non-res / hotel motel, the 2022 code is split out by building type. So we have single-family buildings, multifamily buildings, and then hotel, motel, and non-residential buildings, which is why we now have 3 separate courses split on this for the deeper dives later in February and March. So one big change that also happened for all occupancies is there are updated equipment efficiencies in section 110. It applies to all occupancies, so make sure if you need to pay attention to that, take a look. But this applies to all of them, so we're not going to jump into specifics for this. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Amy.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. So for the next couple sections, folks, I'm going to take you through some single family changes. You can see here it includes townhomes and duplexes also in that kind of category. And then we'll go into some multifamily changes and I'll pass it back to Lauren for the next section. So next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the baseline space heating and water heating updates. That's like the biggest change in some of our EDR thresholds or definitions within the 2022 code. And then go through some of the other measures from attic, kitchen range hoods, ventilation, electric ready and battery ready. We'll go through mandatory and prescriptives as appropriate. We're only going to touch on the kind of key changes. And I think, you know, really under like the single family, we're not seeing significant changes under 2022. Under 2019, we saw a lot of changes in terms of thinking about the solar requirements. Under 2022, big focus on multifamily and the baselines is a significant change, but with the other pieces, they're kind of minor updates, I would say. So let's go to the next slide, Lauren. So under new construction, right, we have the majority of our buildings that come across the permit counter are performance pathway, right? That gives you the most flexibility. And so under 2019, we had the introduction of like the total EDR, energy design rating, and then the efficiency EDR. And they're used to kind of having projects meet both of those, right? You can see, if you recall from 2019, as we're still under it, that total EDR includes the contributions of like PV, storage, demand flexibility. And the efficiency EDR is kind of the ensuring that the home meets the budget under the energy code. Well, as Lauren outlined kind of where the state is going and kind of goals for our buildings and the goals, the state in terms of reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, one of the things is to like, well, how can we address those within our building code? So that ties into the heat pump discussion that we'll have like in a couple of slides, but it also ties into this new EDR, which is EDR source. It's really a proxy for a carbon-based metric. Our code only allows to have metrics that are either cost effective by energy cost or energy consumption. So carbon metric doesn't fall into either of those categories. So the EDR source, which is a non-TDV metric, kind of fills that proxy. So if you go to the next slide, Lauren. Here's just showing you the kind of elements that fall these EDR. So the source is on the left, it's energy usage, it's total energy use of envelope, IQ, HVAC, DHW unregulated loads. And so we want to make sure that the home complies with that allowable budget, in addition to the efficiency EDR, which is TDV, so our time dependent valuation, which is that kind of societal cost per hour. So it includes the same elements as the source, but it's a different metric. It's like the KTDV per square foot per year. Then our total EDR includes those contributions of solar, PV, demand flexibility, other elements that essentially kind of like reduce our total consumption at the site level. So a home to comply with the code now under 2022 will have to meet each of these three elements. Next slide. So now I'm going to take you into, let me just, I'm going to touch on this in a little bit too, but just want to make sure I just say it now because I missed it on the last slide. In our 2022 code, our baseline for single family is either space heating, heat pumps for space heating and or water heating, which means unlike our 2019, what was interesting in our 2019 code is we introduced an electric baseline. So you were compared, if you were all electric, you were compared to all electric. If you were mixed fuel, you were compared to mixed fuel. Now in 2022, we're seeing a switch there where possible, and depending on climate zone, we'll have these slides called out specifically, you'll be compared to an electric baseline for space heating and or water heating. So that's going to be a big difference in terms of demonstrating compliance with the code. Okay, go ahead, Lauren. So let's get into a couple of the different elements of mandatory changes. So here on attic systems, it's now mandatory for new attic systems in climate zones 4 and 8 through 16 to require insulation either above or below the roof deck. Or you can do a combination. That is in addition to what you may have for at the ceiling level, right, above the conditioned floor area. Yep, go ahead. I should keep track of time too. Laura mentioned increased ventilation rates. There's been an incredible amount of discussion over the last couple of years and increased research, lab testing, doing some field testing in terms of ventilation, particularly in kitchens, right, where we have increased particulate matter and NOx, which can contribute to asthma. And because of the proximity to those pollutants when we're cooking, CEC put out new ventilation airflow rates, and you can see it has a couple different metrics in there. One is the dwelling unit floor area and square footage on the left. So your CFM rate is tied to that square footage. And then the next two column, it depends on if you're doing electric or gas range. Now, our particulate matter from our cooking doesn't matter what my fuel source is, right? If I burn something, I'm gonna have that particulate matter either way. But we do see increased pollutants, in particular NOx, coming from gas stoves. So you can see there's an increased CFM requirement for gas over electric ranges. In addition, there's this metric called capture efficiency. It's a performance standard. It's the ASTM, it was developed, and it really is to evaluate the, as it says, the capture efficiency, how that hood is structured and how far it comes over the front burners, what that kind of sump is, to be able to draw that, draw those pollutants into the range hood and exhaust it out of the home. Great. So for ventilation, duct sizing, we have prescriptive standards now. They're referencing the CFM. They have a minimum duct diameter for rigid and for flex. And so if you have a system that meets those bullet points below in terms of the total duct length is less than 25 feet, it doesn't have more than 3 elbows, and you have the exterior termination is not kind of larger than the duct diameter, then you can utilize this table to have that reference CFM and that minimum diameter to meet requirements. There still is testing for ventilation performance with HERS testing to document the CFM delivery. Next slide. So under 2019, right, we had new PV requirements to increase on-site generation. Now under 2022, we're looking at battery ready. And so here we're looking at how do we invest in kind of infrastructure with the new construction project to ensure that we have an easy pathway to add battery storage in the future. And so it's really looking at ensuring that infrastructure, that connectivity for the panel and the capacity in the panel and a raceway is in place. So you can see here we have interconnection equipment with a minimum backup of 60 amps. We have a dedicated raceway, so that's 1 inch from that main service to any sub panels that supply the branch circuits. And we're looking at a minimum of 4 branch circuits should be identified in that kind of feed of a refrigerator, a lighting circuit, and a sleeping room receptacle. So that gives us, those are at least 3 that need to be identified. You're gonna get a 4th. And so this is really looking at ensuring battery ready that will also provide assistance in power outages for kind of critical loads. Our main panel must have a bus rating of 225 amps. Our main panels are 200 amp rating for the capacity. And so the bus bar capacity we just want to ensure is 225 amps to be able to accommodate this energy storage load. There's some additional requirements there in terms of location and ensure that you have space for the transfer switch, which means, you know, kind of like cutting yourself from the grid. Now you're only operating on battery, right? You need that transfer switch for that isolation. And you want the raceway that's installed between the panel board or your main panel and kind of that where that potential equipment can be located, to have that be installed, to allow that easy run of conductors in the future, to support that battery install. Next slide. The other piece of this, as we're looking at, is electric ready. So this was first introduced in our 2019, where we saw pre-wiring for heat pump water heaters. You may recall that introduction, where he said, okay, if you have a heat pump water heater, you must pre-wire, or if you install, excuse me, a natural gas or propane water heater, you must pre-wire for a heat pump water heater. Well, under 2022, taking it a little bit step farther. Now for water heaters, we still have that pre-wire in place for our 240 volt, 30 amp water heater, but there's also space requirements to ensure that there is enough physical space to install that heat pump water heater. So we know heat pump water heaters are a little bit larger than our gas water heaters. And so we now have additional space requirement. In addition, the 2022 has now addressed these other end uses: furnaces, cooktops, and dryers. This probably looks really familiar to any REACH code you may have been party to or needing to comply with under 2019. Oftentimes we'll see in new construction, particularly like larger production new construction, we'll see cooktops and dryers kind of both have gas and electrical. They'll kind of do dual fuel. So there's a kind of a choice there. Now it's required within the code. And the furnaces, we're looking at making sure we have 240 volt, 30 amp for future heat pump installation. All of these need to be pre-wired. We need to have space in the panel. So we need to make sure that capacity is there. We need to be labeling it for future use. And we want that kind of feed in within like 3 feet of where that non-electric appliance location is. So assuming that it's convenient for the future electric appliance. Next slide. So I'd mentioned this earlier, but just putting it, just calling it out here in terms of the prescriptive table. So heat pump space heating, if you're going a prescriptive package, is required in 3, 4, 13, and 14. Or you can go the performance route, right? Where you're going to be, if you're not installing a heat pump, you're going to be kind of trading it off for trading it off and kind of taking that hit in terms of your energy consumption. Next slide. On the domestic hot water slide, on the domestic hot water side, we have requirements for, so where we had space heating for the previous climate zones, 3, 4, 13, and 14 as our baseline. Now for kind of the remaining climate zones, we have domestic hot water for that baseline, 5, 6, 9, and 16, where we're looking at, it's either a 240 volt heat pump water heater that's NEA tier 3, or you can do a standard heat pump water heater with some additional prescriptive criteria to account for that variance in efficiency from a NEA tier 3. Or you can have a solar water heating system with a 70% solar fraction. So really we're looking at, again, kind of driving toward the use of heat pump water heaters. And there are some exceptions, as you can see down below, where they're looking at opportunities or kind of creating some flexibility in different climate zones to use a gas tankless. And you can have a point of use, right? So if I have an instantaneous electric water heater, like at a point of use, like under a sink or in a master bathroom that may be farther away from my water heater or something of that, that's allowable. And then the last bullet point there is new dwelling units with 1 bedroom or less can use 120 volt heat pump water heater. So those of you have seen stuff kind of coming out in the market. We are seeing these kind of 120 volt, 15 amp, 20 amp, 15 amp heat pump water heaters that are kind of compressor only, that are great for smaller units. Next slide. The only thing I want to call out here in terms of variance for solar PV is that there's a new exception that there's no PV prescriptively required if the minimum size is less than 1.8 kW or the solar access roof is less than 80 square feet. That exception exists in our code today, but the less than 1.8 kW is a new exception. And then, you know, the equation is there. I will note for folks who may kind of do some of the equations, like if you do this equation literally by hand and kind of calculate it out prescriptively, and then you take that building and put it in the model and kind of see what it says, there may be some slight variance there because the model will take into a couple other elements into account and kind of hitting that equation, so you won't get the exact same answer. Just want to call that out because people have had that question of why there is that variance. But this one exception is just a new exception for single family. Okay, I think that's it, Lauren. So that's our single family. Like I said, the biggest thing is really looking at heat pumps as our baseline. And I don't think we put other pieces in here, but there's a number of programs and kind of incentive structures that are kind of rolling out to be able to support that, both single family and multifamily. Really focusing on our heat pump for space heating, or space conditioning, I should say, and water heating. This next section of multifamily was a significant push for the CEC to undertake. If you've worked in multifamily, you can, even under 2019, you can recall you're looking under the non-res portion and then you're flipping back to the low rise to look at domestic hot water and maybe some lighting, and you're kind of going back and forth and trying to figure out what's what. And you have this variation of low rise of 3 habitable stories or less and high rise for habitable stories or more. So now we have everything, as Lauren pointed out earlier, now in its own chapter. So things got pulled out of the low rise, got renamed single family. All of those are now in the multifamily chapter, and then the non-res chapter now only accounts for non-res occupancies as well as hotel and motel. Thank you. So we're going to go through some of these changes. Some of them are really similar to single family. So we're having this alignment because we're looking at a number of elements within dwelling units. And so where that's appropriate, there's been a lot of alignment there. So we'll see alignment again between single family and the unit elements in multifamily. And then for the common areas, we're going to see alignment with the non-res changes. Next slide. This just shows you the sections. I just wanted to put this up here just so you can see it's really kind of matches the same order and section titles as a single family, but now it's all covering multifamily. One thing I will just call out quickly before we go on to some of the changes is that even though we have multifamily all together, and we're not kind of utilizing this kind of low rise or high rise term, we do have requirements that are differentiated by number of stories. So you'll see that called out in some of the prescriptive tables or some of the requirements and applications. But so we still do have variances by number of stories for multifamily. Okay. Next slide.
Before we jump in there,
Oh, sure.
Looks like we have a quick question. How are mixed use buildings categorized? 3 floors residential and bottom floor commercial.
So mixed use, you're looking at what is and applying the usage for like 80% of the conditioned floor area. And so you'll be applying that code to those uses. Okay. Electric ready. So similar to single family we saw. We're looking at pre-wiring, making sure we have the ability to install heat pump technologies in the future if they're not installed today. So again, any propane or natural gas installed or plumbed appliances will have a conduit and capacity to be electric in the future. So all of these similar elements apply as in their single family. Next slide. Dwelling unit requirements. So that kitchen hood table that we were looking at before also applies to dwelling units for single family. I mean, so dwelling units and multifamily. We just didn't repeat the slide here. And it's really where kind of an important element of it that showed up in terms of those square footages, because we do have smaller apartments, and we want to kind of make sure that flow rate is reasonable for the conditioned floor area and not too much, but really effective, so we can remove those pollutants in those homes. We have some new minimum efficiency requirements for ERVs and HRVs and HERS verification requirements for the systems within multifamily. And central ventilation, we have moved from prescriptive duct sealing into mandatory duct sealing requirements, 6%. And verification, I want to call this out, and this is again where we see some variances in number of stories. So where we are looking at verification of, performance, whether duct leakage or quality insulation installation or any of those types of measures, kitchen range hood ventilation. If it's 3 stories or less, we're looking at HERS raters doing that verification. If it's 4 stories above, we're looking at installing contractors that are doing verification. Water heating pipe insulation, just want to call this out. It's been updated. It's more stringent than the table on 120. That's non-res. The 120 table is really space heating water pipes. So just want to call out that it's different. It's more stringent. This is focusing on water heating. And it's an updated table. Next slide. Okay. So roof and ceiling insulation, going back, under 2019, we got rid of option A and we only had option B and C. And now we have option D. So we have our prescriptive table, our component package table that outlines all of the requirements by climate zone. And so we have option B, that is for the below roof deck insulation design. We have option C, that is if you have the ducts in conditioned space. And then we have option D, so it's a non-attic roof, right? So we're looking at kind of really those kind of filled cavities where we have a flat roof, which we do see often in multifamily. So there's minimal changes here, but just wanted to call out the kind of table structure has changed slightly. Go to the next slide. That we see, this is only just kind of option B. We just kind of pulled out one portion of the table. But you can see it includes the below deck insulation values for the space, the ceiling insulation requirements. It also includes the radiant barrier. And then it's also including the age solar reflectance thermal emittance, or SRI, both for low sloped and steep sloped roofs. So all this now is kind of in one table, whereas previously it was kind of separated out. So that's really what I wanted to call out, but not a lot of changes here. Just looking at, we now have option D kind of under our multifamily umbrella. Again, in the component package, we have wall insulation, floor insulation, opaque exterior doors. They're all called out by climate zone, as you can see kind of across the top there. And then this is just a portion of that table showing the walls, because they're categorized by wall type. We also are categorized by floor type. And then for the opaque doors, you'll have by door type, right? Like common area, swinging door, etc. So those are all called out by type, and then the associated U factor is shown in the table. So we have a maximum U factor, and then you can see it's a minimum. Like if we look at you know, these walls here, and we're looking at the either the light or the heavy door mass, the two lower rows, that's a maximum U factor and minimum R value, right? So R13 is my minimum, and my maximum U factor is 0.077. So each of them have that kind of min and max. Okay, go ahead, Lauren. So quality installation is now required for new construction projects. Again, looking at kind of a height limit here for 3 habitable stories or less. So it's going to be really hard to trade this one off, which means you'll be seeing it more in the performance approach. And we'll be having more HERS raters out on multifamily buildings. You can see there we do have climate zone 7 is exempt, kind of looking at just because of kind of lower loads, that was exempt. And just again, calling out, this does not apply to the 4+ stories, only for 3 habitable stories or less. Okay, next slide. On the fenestration side, just calling out a couple of changes. There are some updates in here, but wanted to call out the structure of the table now in terms of, you can see it's got fenestration, and then it's called out by product type. So in here, we've got the curtain wall / storefront. We have, my glasses are fogging. The performance class, and then we have all other fenestration. So depending on your product type, you're going to look at that first column, and then you can look at the performance criteria for whether it's visible transmittance or minimum U factor. You can look at those associated with that specific product type. And then in addition to that, we have fenestration area allowance based on, you know, minimum window to floor area ratio in that top row, which is pretty much consistently 20% across for all climate zones, and minimum window to wall ratio, which is 40% pretty much consistently across all of those climate zones. So just have this structure of product type. And I also want to call out number of floors. So, oh, sorry, Lauren. Just so if we just take curtain wall for an example, you have your minimum U factor, but then if we're looking at this HGC, there is different thresholds for 3 stories or 4 or more. Just be on the lookout for that when we have these differentiations within the table, as we're kind of looking at the applications to different multifamily building heights. Okay. So on our space conditioning side, we've kind of talked about this for 3 stories or less. Our space conditioning shall be a heat pump in 4 through 6 and 9. In 16, it can be a furnace with an AC, really because of, I think, the concerns over a colder climate. There are discussions there, but this was a place where the CEC made an exception because of concern over performance in colder climates. For 4 stories and above, the space conditioning is the same. It shall be a heat pump in 4 through 6 and 9. And then under 16, it can be a dual fuel heat pump. And again, just calling out the kind of performance baseline for is a heat pump for space conditioning, again, required to comply with that energy budget for source. I didn't mention this, but under multifamily, we're not having that EDR threshold, but we have an energy budget for source, and we have an energy budget for TDD. So we're not going to see that EDR under multifamily. If you recall, under 2019, we had an EDR for low rise, and then for high rise, we had the budget. So now for multifamily, it's kind of a consistent metric of just a budget. Great. For ERVs and HRVs, this is really focused on dwelling units. There's a table in there. It covers kind of all stories, but just calling out a couple nuances for the 3 stories and 4 stories plus. So if I have a heat pump for space conditioning and I'm 3 stories or less in climate zones 4 through 10, I have some fan efficacy requirements there of less than or equal to 0.4 watts per CFM. So looking at more stringent efficacy requirements for that condition. For the second bullet point there, 4+ stories in climate zones 1 through 2 and 11 through 16, where I'm utilizing the balanced ventilation to meet my ASHRAE 62.2 requirements, and it's serving multiple units. There are these performance requirements to ensure we're installing higher performing ERVs or HRVs because they're going to be operating to provide that whole building mechanical ventilation for multiple units, or that whole home mechanical ventilation. We want it to be higher performing. So there's recovery, minimum recovery efficiency factors you can see there at 67%. We have fan efficacy requirements for these fans, and we have recovery bypass or controls to really economize, like it says, economize with ventilation air based on outdoor air temperature limits. And so again, if we're looking at the operation of these types of systems, because they are providing, meeting the ASHRAE 62.2, there are additional requirements for efficiency. That's it. Okay. Again, for common area fans, where we're looking at fans that are kind of moving air in between conditioned spaces, or tempering air, bringing it in or out, or filtering air into common area spaces, there are additional new requirements to limitations of that fan power. So there's the fan power limitations and energy budget. And there's specific requirements for dedicated outdoor air systems. You'll see it abbreviated as DOAS. These are all really similar to the non-residential requirements, which are called out in more detail that we'll see in a little bit. And so this is where I was talking about when we have systems that are applied to common area, we were going to see alignment with our non-residential standards versus, again, the units we'll see align with the single family standards as much as possible. Okay, next slide. For domestic hot water, which is one of the biggest loads and kind of key end uses, I would say, in multifamily, there's 3 different options that can be installed. So we talked about the individual dwelling units of, we can do a 240 volt heat pump water heater. It's going to be NEA rated tier 3. And you can even do a gas propane instantaneous water heater. If we're looking at central systems for heat pump water heaters that are serving multiple units, so, and we're saying this is greater than 8 units, there's some additional prescriptive conditions that occur or are required. And really this is to get at what can we put into place to support the higher performance of that central system. For those of you who have been involved in modeling or installing or working within the code in terms of central heat pump water heater systems, it's definitely been an evolving process in terms of what is included in our software and kind of what's allowed and what are prescriptive thresholds for it. And so really what we have here is looking at some requirements for return temperature, operating temperature, in terms of maybe we're kind of optimizing that because we want to see some differential between what we're supplying and that return temperature coming back. We want to see the return, the hot water return go to a tank and not to the primary heater itself. If we have a recirc water heater, because there are some systems that will have a dedicated recirc water heater. So you may have like a large central plant, and then your recirc is being maintained by an individual water heater. That needs to be electric. It can be electric resistance or heat pump, but it needs to be electric. And they have some requirements in here just in terms of single pass and multi-pass. Again, based on the operation of those single pass, it's going through once through the system. And so we want to have that plumbed in series, right, as we're looking at that tanks and to get out to the building. Multi-pass is going to kind of go through multiple times, and you'll see variance in that temperature differential, and those are kind of plumbed in parallel. So there's some requirements in there. We'll go into more of these in detail in the a multifamily training. And then on the right, you have gas and propane that are serving multiple units. So note that you don't have that kind of 8-unit limit here. There are some requirements in terms of our input rating, right? And 90% thermal efficiency is what we're looking for. So essentially, we're kind of looking at the condensing systems. Solar water heating systems have a minimum solar fraction savings by climate zone. You can see listed out there. If I include a drain water heat recovery, I can get a 5% reduction in my solar fraction. And then the one piece that's called out that does differentiate by number of units is my recirc loop. I don't have to have a dual recirc loop if I have less than 8 units. A dual recirc loop means half the units are served by one recirc loop and the other half is served by the other. But if it's less than 8 units, you don't really need that. That dual recirc loop is to kind of reduce losses over time. Okay. Indoor lighting, I'm going to go through lighting relatively quickly, I think. So dwelling units are matching single family changes. Common area requirements are mostly matching non-residential changes. So, and you can go to the next slide. If we look at some of the area category allowances for common areas, we just showed a portion of the table showing the power density values. They're getting more stringent. Their reference point is LEDs. So overall, we're just seeing that increased stringency. Next slide. There's been just a couple of definition changes for clarity, particularly as we are kind of defining multifamily in of itself. So the residential outdoor lighting controls, as we like, what do those apply to when you're thinking about a multifamily building? And so it's been defined that they apply to those lights controlled from within the dwelling unit, right? So if I have additional lights that are lighting away to an apartment or a unit or something like that, but they're controlled as part of the common area mechanism, then my residential outdoor lighting controls do not apply to those. So you can think about these of like your front porch or back porch type of lighting. The outdoor lighting zone applications, they've changed a bit, really. There used to be kind of 3 zones, and now we have an additional zone where urban has been broken out into 2 zones. So that's a recent change. The next slide. Under general hardscapes, there's been a change here. You'll notice that we just have area wattage allowance and initial wattage allowance. We don't have the linear wattage allowance, right? Which is that contribution as you're kind of like totaling up the perimeter of that hardscape and kind of determining what is allowable under the code. So now we're just looking at area and initial wattages for the general hardscapes. So a slight change in that methodology. Next slide. So solar access for the roof. So we want the area of the roof that's capable of supporting PV, right? So this is kind of like, what is my solar ready area? It's all of the area covered, parking areas or carports, anything that may be compatible with supporting PV. Where I have exceptions is if I have less than 70% annual solar access, so I have really limited solar access that it's not worth kind of ensuring that PV can be included. It can be an occupied roof area, then I'm not looking at having it be solar ready, or it's not otherwise available to some other requirements. Next slide. We have 2 different calculations for PV for multifamily. So again, we have less than or equal to 3 stories. So we can utilize this table. It's similar to what we have now for low-rise residential, right? The factors haven't changed. What we do, again, is I called out under single family, we have that new exception of if that minimum kW of PV that's required is less than 1.8, then the project is exempt from the prescriptive requirement of PV. or snow load exemptions. So those are two new exemptions, but this approach hasn't changed for low-rise residential from 2019. But we do have a calculation for 4+ stories, you can see here. So it's a slightly different calculation where we're looking at conditioned floor area times that adjustment factor and divided by 1,000 to get my system size. And so this is just accounting for kind of a different methodology because we will have a smaller kind of total roof area as as we look at the number of stories. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So a couple of exceptions that we'll see here for the 4+ stories. So if that solar, access roof area is less than 3% of the conditioned floor area, then I have that exemption. If the required size is less than 4 kW, then I'm exempt. If I have less than 80 contiguous square feet, so it's just not enough area that is viable in terms of, it's viable for producing PV, but from a cost effectiveness standpoint, it's not a large enough area, then I'm exempt. And there can be exemptions through different roof designs and also snow loads that may allow a project to be exempt from the prescriptive PV. Okay. And then we have battery storage. So this is battery storage for 4+ stories. We have a couple of different things. We're looking at the minimum energy capacity for the battery. And we're also looking at the minimum rated power capacity. So we have kWh, right, is my energy capacity and what I can provide. And then I have a minimum kW, which is my power. So this is required prescriptively. You have to meet both of those equations that are shown here. And you're going to be looking at kind of the specification sheet. You'll be doing this approach and then looking at the specification sheet for your battery to see if it's going to meet these requirements. There are some exceptions for providing battery storage for 4 stories or more. On the next slide. So it's not required if the installed PV system is less than 15% of the equation determined for the PV requirements, or if the battery storage requirement is less than 10 kWh rated capacity. So really the key here is looking at, do I have a reasonable PV system size in that first bullet to kind of provide the charge to my battery system, right? I want to make sure that there's a reasonable match there from a cost effectiveness standpoint. So that's what kind of informed that first bullet. The second bullet there is like, as we're looking at 4 stories or more, if the calculation is showing me less than 10 kWh rated capacity, then from a cost effectiveness standpoint, it'd be hard to require that. So you have that exception in there too. You can always do it voluntarily, but from a required standpoint, it's exempt. And I think at this point I can pass it back over to Lauren.
Great. We do have one question, which maybe we can take now since I think it might be a quick one. I believe this is for QII, but please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Installing contractors will need to have some sort of verification to know, duct leakage. Installing contractors will need to have some sort of verification to know how to perform the duct leakage verifications. Is that correct? Going back to one of the
the verification. Under right now we have measures that require, if we look at both like multifamily, even single family, where we look at kind of our verification kind of methodology built into our code, right? We have our 1Rs, which are like, I'm submitting for permit, this is my design and my intent. We have our 2Rs, which are completed by the installing contractor. And so we have measures today that are only documented by installing contractor utilizing a 2R. Some examples of that are like battery or PV. All right, well, that's just 2 examples. And then we have measures that require HERS verification, which requires a 3R. when I do that 3R for a HERS rater, I'm still collecting a 2R from that installing contractor. And so there will be documentation that the installing contractor is providing for that. I don't know if that's answering the question. I think, we do have measures that are verified only by installing contractors. Under non-residential, we have some like non-residential verification compliance pathways that we'll kind of put to the side right now. I think that answers the question.
Cool.
That they will have to complete a document. Great. Thanks, Stacy.
Okay, let's jump into non-residential changes. And something I think we forgot to mention at the beginning, I'm sure most people have picked up on it already, but across the top bar of the slides, we put the code section in the upper right-hand corner, and then whether or not it's a prescriptive or a mandatory change across the top bar, the color will change based on mandatory or prescriptive. Just a note for looking at the slides later. So let's jump into some of the non-residential high-level changes. Again, this is meant to be a high-level overview of what's coming. If you want to do a deeper dive into the non-residential changes, please attend the March 7th course. So some of the updates that we have for non-residential, we have some fenestration, envelope changes. There's quite a bit for HVAC. Some, like Amy kind of touched on, some lighting changes for definitions, and then PV system and battery system changes. A lot of the more significant changes were for covered processes in the current update, both to include new processing loads, as well as additional requirements that were being applied to those process loads that were covered previously. So let's jump into fenestration. A new mandatory change for us is the certification of fenestration products and exterior doors other than field fabricated are based on U-Factor, SHGC, and VT. The NA6 formula can only be used for skylights that are less than or equal to 200 square feet, and it is not allowed for vertical fenestration. So essentially, what this means is you'll be using NFRC tested products in almost all applications. And this is just an overview of one of the tables that have changed. The window performance is now climate zone specific for fixed windows, and curtain walls or storefronts. So take a look at table 140.3-B for additional information. This is just a partial table. It looks like this slide got messed up. Oh, there we go. The envelope requirements in the same table have also changed. So you can kind of see on the screen where they've made some changes to the metal framed walls. So there's a lower minimum U factor that's required. And then also there's a higher minimum required for age solar reflectance and thermal emittance. And lastly, an air barrier is now required in all climate zones. Some of the HVAC changes that we're seeing for 2022, there have been increased efficiencies for various cooling systems, cooling towers, furnaces, and boilers starting at, they're starting at a later date. And then there are some new tables for dedicated outdoor air systems, computer room units, and heat pump and heat recovery chillers. So ventilation rates are based on the minimum ventilation rate and occupiable square footage. So there's an alternate method based on occupants for spaces with fixed seating. And then design and control requirements for quantities of outdoor air have also changed. So all mechanical ventilation and space conditioning systems need to be tested to confirm that they operate within 10% of the minimum outside air rate. And the variable air volume systems need to be capable of maintaining measured outside air rates within 10% of the design minimum. Duct leakage testing, a new change for us. New duct systems must be HERS tested to verify no more than 6% leakage, as long as they apply under the bullet points under there. So providing conditioned air to an occupiable space, serving less than 5,000 square foot of conditioned floor area, and have more than 25% of ducts in unconditioned space or outdoors. This was previously a prescriptive requirement. Under 2022, it's now required. New duct systems that are exempt from the mandatory requirements are new for this code cycle. So those exemptions are new, including the exemptions below. So healthcare facilities and new duct systems that are not subject to testing instead need to meet the duct leakage testing requirements of the code listed on the screen. So yeah, just take my notes. So jumping into a quick, some of the prescriptive changes for HVAC, kind of like we've been seeing with multifamily, heat pump is now a lot of the baseline for a lot of these and the requirements. So the main takeaway is that, wherever possible, heat pumps are attempted to be slotted in. There are a few exceptions where you can use a furnace and AC, mostly in climate zone 16 and one in occasional building uses. Boilers, so in climate zones 1 through 6, 9 through 14, and 16, there's a new requirement for space heating gas boiler systems. This also requires a 90% minimum thermal efficiency. Oh, whoops, here we go. And to achieve this 90% efficiency, some or all of the boilers must have a condensing capability. Boilers within the same building but on separate loops are not considered part of the same systems. There are exemptions that apply. Take a look. The coils and other heat exchangers must be designed for hot water return temp of 120 degrees Fahrenheit or less. And the flow rate is reduced on these requirements to less than or equal to 20% of the design flow of the operating boilers. Fan power systems. So this applies to all fans moving air in, out, or between conditioned spaces, or circulating air in between conditioned space. The allowances on the table on the right. This is just a partial table, vary by type, CFM, and number of floors served. So make sure you're looking at the right spot based on number of floors. For elevations of less than 3,000 feet, you need to multiply the fan budget by the correction factor listed in table 140.4-C. So take a look at that. And again, at system design, flow cannot exceed budget. So make sure you're keeping an eye.
And Lauren,
yeah,
sorry, I was just going to say, just as folks are looking at that, these requirements, these new prescriptive requirements are meant to cover fans that are not covered by other requirements. And so you'll see in the exceptions, if it's covered by this other standard, then this does not apply. So it's not kind of superseding other requirements, but kind of plugging a gap where other thresholds were not in, or other requirements were not there. Go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Economizers are, under this code cycle, are broadening the application of requirements for economizers to lower capacity units. So these are prescriptively required when the air handler has a cooling capacity of less than 33,000 BTU per hour. This was previously 54,000. So we are now focusing on smaller rooftop units, smaller split, dedicated air handlers, and VRFs and mini splits. There is a new exception that air handlers that have a design cooling capacity of less than 54,000 BTU per hour and ventilation is provided by a dedicated outdoor air system with exhaust heat recovery. There are a few more criteria under that, but we didn't want to include it on the slide. Some if you are going to be using or qualifying for that exemption, make sure you take a look. And dedicated outdoor air systems, they're units that are used to filter, condition, or temper air separate from the space conditioning system. So this is the goal of this is to limit reheating of the air coming back in of one of the requirements. So dedicated outdoor air systems that are providing cooling to providing mechanical cooling, ventilation to multiple zones, and operating in conjunction with zoned heating. You want to make sure that the warm supply air does not get warmed above 60 degrees when the building load or the outdoor air temperature indicates that the majority of zones require cooling. So this is also helped or meant to help reduce our energy usage. And then this also applies for certain climate zones. The exemptions that I just mentioned for the economizers is also applies or kind of goes hand in hand with the DOAS system. If the input power is less than 1 kW, you cannot exceed a total combined fan power of 1 watt per CFM. If it's greater than 1, you need to meet the requirements in 104.4C. Supply air needs to be delivered directly to the occupied space or at the outlet of any terminal of heating or cooling coils. The supply air should cycle off any zoned heating and cooling equipment fans, circulation pumps, and terminal unit fans when there's no call for heating or cooling in the zone. This is for certain climate zones, and certain air handler requirement or air handler design scenarios may also require exhaust air heat recovery, which I'll jump into. The table values that you see below, this is again another excerpt. It's quite a long table. The values are listed in CFM. And they are dependent on climate zone and percent of outdoor air at full design airflow, as well as number of hours per year. Depending on the hours per year, you'll go either to table J or table K for your design criteria. Compliance is also triggered if a decoupled dedicated outdoor air system is utilizing the exhaust air heat recovery to avoid economizer requirements. So make sure you're keeping an eye on that if you do end up applying for that exemption. And again, one of the sort of main things to pull out of this is you cannot use supply fans to meet the air change requirements anymore. So you either have to use a sensible energy recovery ratio of at least 60%, or use an enthalpy recovery ratio of at least 50% for both heating and cooling. You can use an energy recovery bypass or control to disable the energy recovery and directly economize with ventilated air based on outdoor air temperature. Take a look at table G for those temperature limits. And then for energy recovery systems where the transfer of energy can't be stopped, you need to have a bypass that can prevent total airflow rate or outdoor air or exhaust air through the energy recovery exchanger from exceeding 10% of the full design airflow rate. And again, there are additional exemptions included. We made a note of those on the screen, or a note of the section on the screen for your future reference. Similar to what Amy was touching on non-res, we are trying to use a heat pump water heater system wherever possible. So school buildings that are less than 25,000 square feet and less than 4 stories would be required to use a heat pump water heater system as long as you're within climate zones 2 through 15. Any other non-residential occupancies, you can use any water heater. It has to be at least 90% efficient if the combined input rate is less than 1 million BTU per hour. There is an exemption for water heating systems serving an individual bathroom space. That can be an instantaneous electric water heater, just like Amy touched on in multifamily. And then hotel motel is the same requirements as previously mentioned for individual or central hot water heating systems. Jumping into controlled environmental horticulture. So this is a mandatory change. This was a new section that was added to address indoor growing in conditioned greenhouses, mainly with a focus on cannabis growing. So a lot of these changes cover electric lighting for growing plants. They now have to have a high photosynthetic photon efficacy, or PPE, which is spectrum efficient for growing plants. So you're able to grow plants at a higher efficiency lighting system, saving energy for everyone. And they also have to have dimming and time clock controls. Touching on dehumidification, they need to meet federal dehumidifier standards or recover at least 75% of the heat used for reheat. So we want to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible, reusing that heat that we've already generated. And then lastly, conditioned greenhouses need to have at least 2 glazing layers to make sure that we're both keeping the heat out when we don't want it and keeping the heat in when we do want it. And there are additional requirements for both mandatory and prescriptive requirements for computer rooms, refrigeration, process boilers, and controlled receptacles. We decided not to touch on them today, both to save time and due to demand. If you want to learn more about these, please, again, attend the training on the 17th that is focused solely on non-residential changes. Indoor lighting. So most of these changes have either had a reduction in value, majority a reduction. There are a couple that have had some increases, mostly looking at area category lighting. They've had both reductions and increases in lighting power density and allowance changes. The power adjustment factors have had savings reductions for office applications. Complete building lighting allowances have had reductions in some lighting power density values, and they also added 2 new building types. So keep an eye out for that. Tailored lighting allowances and tailored lighting general allowances have had both all lighting power density values have been reduced. And then outdoor lighting, as Amy mentioned, so the lighting zone designations have changed. The urban now has 2 zones. It's called urban clusters and urban areas. And they also gave a bunch of examples for each category to give everybody a better idea. General hardscape allowances, values have been reduced, and asphalt and concrete are no longer differentiated. There are also quite a bit of footnotes in those tables, so make sure you take a look. And then specific lighting applications have added security cameras as a new application. Solar access roof area. Amy already went over this. It's the same requirements as multifamily. This includes the area of the building's roof space capable of supporting PV, as well as all those uncovered parking areas, carports, and other structures on site that are capable of supporting a PV system. The exceptions that are on the screen are the same that we went over in the multifamily section. PV system sizing has is different from multifamily. So there are 2 methods of calculating PV system size. You need to use whichever is smaller. So the 2 equations are right on the screen. So it's either the same equation for 4+ stories, or you can do total solar access roof area times 14 watts per square foot. So this applies to new construction or mixed occupancy buildings where 1 or more of the building types constitute at least 80% of the floor area of the building. So it's up to you to pick which equation, but you need to use whichever is smaller. Again, the exemptions are the same as multifamily that we touched on earlier. The reason behind a lot of these is, either it's not cost effective for you to install PV on such a small section, or it's not going to support enough of the building to make a difference. Battery storage. So similar to the multifamily and single family, all buildings that are required to have a PV system also need to have a battery storage system. The 2 equations that we'll be using for that are rated energy capacity and rated power capacity. They need to be no less than the values that are determined by those equations. And then if the building has more than one space type, then the battery system capacity for the building needs to be determined by both equations. So you do equations for both use types, sum them together, and that's how you get your system size. Some of these exceptions include, if a PV system is too small, same as multifamily, we don't want to be installing a battery system that cannot support the PV system, or if it's just not cost effective at all. An additional exemption is single tenant buildings with less than 5,000 square foot of conditioned floor area. In multi-tenant buildings, if the energy and the power capacities of the battery storage system need to be based on the tenant spaces with more than 5,000 square feet of conditioned floor area. And then these are the two equations that we'll be using. So one for energy capacity, one for power capacity. They look very similar that we've seen before. And yeah, I think we left just enough time for questions at the end. Amy, do we have any questions in the chat?
We don't have any questions that I see in the chat, so feel free to put some in. A couple of thoughts that came to mind as we were going through here. One is, you can, as folks can see with this reorganization, of different sections and kind of how we're categorizing buildings, we will see obviously the update to our compliance software to reflect these changes. So that will be coming down the pike. That comes later. We will see the final version of our code in July 1 is when it has to be published. So right now we're working off of express terms, as you identified earlier, Lauren, and also draft documents. So our final publication is July 1. And the other thing I just wanted to call out, just in case we didn't make it clear, we just focused on the new construction aspects of the code right now and didn't dig into the changes that apply to additions and alterations. Those do exist. Don't worry, there are changes for those too. But we will kind of dig into those in each of the subsequent 3 trainings. So those will be referenced at that time, but I just wanted to make sure we called that out when we're clear on what we were covering today.
And maybe while everyone is thinking of their questions, I can hand it over to Sean to do some 3C Rent overview and upcoming events.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Amy. Cover a lot of ground this morning. So yeah, will y'all think of any questions you have? Feel free to put them in the chat. We'll have a moment to discuss them at the end of this. Will I just cover a few more 3C Ren kind of basics about the resources we offer to help you? I will pull up a meeting usefulness poll. We'll see if that launches here. Feel free to fill that out. It's 4 questions while I run through this section, or while you think of your questions as well. Great. And just to reiterate, 3C Ren does offer 3 programs. That's Energy Code Connect, Building Performance Training, and Home Energy Savings. Perfect. Next slide. And for Energy Code Connect, I'm happy to share that our Energy Code coaches are now available to answer questions and to get in contact with them over text message. So it's the same number that you might have called in the past, the same number that's on our website. You can now reach them, send your questions, request a form over text message. You can save that number as a contact in your phone, include a picture for a form or project you're working on. And Lauren and the rest of the Energy Code Coach team will respond to those questions within 2 hours during normal business hours. So a pretty quick response time for any questions you may have. Again, that's the same number. Happy to launch the service for y'all and hope you find it useful and beneficial. Perfect. Next slide. And again, our program Energy Code Connect really is aiming to help everyone better comply and comprehend and enforce the energy code here locally. To do so, we offer those 3 services. Again, our Energy Code Coaches, which is available online over the phone and now in the field as well, and now via text to help navigate the Energy Code Coach with some more one-on-one coaching, personalized support. We offer our trainings, which help with, again, overall energy code comprehension, and regional forums, which cover some policy and technical issues relevant to the energy code and relevant to our region. Again, visit 3c-ren.org/codes for more information. Perfect. Next slide. In the same vein, our building performance training program serves a little bit of a broader audience, not just specific to the energy code, with trainings for architects, engineers, contractors, and real estate professionals. We're also doing some agricultural grower trainings this year as well, specializing in soft skills, so high performance building principles, systems for high performance buildings, and as well as soft skills for sales, marketing, and communication about these techniques in order to help advance your business or market to your customers. Through both building performance training and Energy Code Connect, we do offer professional education credits, which I'll touch on a little bit in a few slides too. And also offer certifications like the National Association of Realtors Green Designation and Passive House certifications, including one we hope to offer this year for tradespeople. Perfect. Next slide. Finally, our home energy savings, which serves kind of the broader community and is specifically focused on some of the residents who missed out on previous direct install programs. So low income residents, rural residents, renters, those whose primary language is not English. We offer 2 kind of programs, our multifamily program. And we're able to do things like simple upgrades like LED light bulbs, smart thermostats, free power strips, as well as some discounted, more intensive upgrades like installing heat pump water heaters, Energy Star appliances, some air sealing around the windows and insulation as well, and no cost technical assistance for these projects. So our multifamily program is now launched. You can learn more at 3c-ren.org/home, and our single family program is coming soon. All right. Perfect. I'll go ahead and end the poll now. So thank you all for responding. Really appreciate that. Just for some final housekeeping for this course, we do have those learning units available. So if you did enter your AIA or ICC number, we'll get those out to you shortly. If you did not and you would like to receive credit for this course, you can contact myself. My email's on the screen. It'll also be in the follow-up email and in the slides here. And like Lauren and Amy mentioned, this kind of 2022 Energy Code preview series will continue with more information with some of the events listed here, continuing out through February and into March. Thank you, Lauren, for dropping the event calendar link. So go ahead and check those out, register for the trainings that you might find helpful. But I really appreciate y'all joining us today, and look out for that follow-up email I'll be sending out shortly. So with that, Lauren, Amy, are there any questions that have come in, or I'll open the floor up for anyone who wants to pipe in right now too.
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, yeah, not seeing any in the chat either. Give you one more minute for any questions, but yeah, other than that, I appreciate all the content today. And I'll include your information in the follow-up email. And we have our Energy Code Coach hotline and email and web form to continue to offer the opportunity for questions. So we do have you covered if your questions don't come up until a little later.
Yeah, please feel free to submit any questions you have from this training or any other type of code questions to the Code Coach hotline so that we can help better understand what everyone's kind of dealing with and how we can tailor some of our trainings moving forward.
Well, great. I think with that, yeah, still not seeing any questions. That's fine. I think we'll go ahead and end it up here. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Amy. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and covering a lot of ground today. Thank you.
So
Awesome.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good morning.
Bye all.